Welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey guys, well, I'm excited to have a conversation today. I've got Chris Haven and Max Botner on the line here, and thank you guys so much for joining me today.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Awesome. So, Max, why don't you start? I'd love for you guys just to introduce yourself, kind of briefly, just who you are, and what you're doing, and what you're. So, the conversation we're going to start to have is around, the family kind of commands or codes that are described in the New Testament. Do those apply today? How do we think about that? So, any relevant information on your background or your level of why are you interested in this topic? So, Max, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeremy. So, I'm a college professor. I teach now at a Christian liberal arts school in California, but prior to that, I was at a seminary in Michigan. That's how I met Chris at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. And the household codes have always been an interest of mine, probably going back to my seminary education. I didn't grow up in the church, so the idea of biblical manhood, womanhood, and all these other kind of conversations that are commonplace in the church weren't really on my radar till later in life, when I learned from my college pastor at the time, like there were certain things men should do, certain things women should do. And that was like a new concept for me. And I didn't give much thought to it really at a deeper level till I went to seminary. I went to Fuller Seminary back in like 2011 through 13 or something like that. And I've just enjoyed diving into the history. I think it involves why I appreciate these conversations. They are difficult conversations to have for several reasons. One is, I think we have to be sensitive to the fact that even if there are different ways to interpret the texts have been abused in various ways to mistreat other people, whether we're talking about using these texts to justify the unjust enslavement of other human beings, or just to justify abuse in marital situations, which I know Christians who arrive at different positions don't want. Yeah. But we have to be aware when we're going into these conversations that's present, that's there. And so kind of my pastoral heart in all of this is just to help my students or any audience I get a chance to talk to think through the dynamics of what these texts are doing in their ancient context, and then think really carefully about, how we should live them out today. What is the mandate for us today? And I think the conversation really helps us think carefully about biblical interpretation more broadly as well. So I appreciate the conversation for that reason.
Awesome. Very good. And Chris, what's your level of interest in this topic?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jeremy, for having us. And mine, I think, would be both on the sort of the theoretical side, but also the practical side. So, Jeremy, you and I are sort of living into more of a simplified, simple church, micro church kind of environment. And I think aside from all the absolutely fascinating things theologically and historically and, in the culture and whatnot, there's a lot of practical need to really understand these passages as we seek to live into them, to actually put them into practice. I would say much more so even than in more of the dominant paradigm of church that we experience in America, because we actually have people that are engaging in the one another's that we see in these passages. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking more of like 1 Corinthians 10 to 14 and things of that nature, where when we have these small gatherings, we have opportunities to each one bring a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, an interpretation, let everything be done for mutual edification. And so for us, it's not just theoretical, it's how do we actually put these into practice in ways that edify, but are also obedient to the principles of Scripture. So I have both, I guess, the theoretical interest, but also the real practical interest in how this gets worked out in our own context.
Yeah, very good. Well, this will be a fun conversation. Go ahead,
yeah,
Max.
Can I add one more thing to that too? Because that's really helpful, Chris. I think that when we approach an issue that intersects with, for example, the question of what women can and can't do in church, it's helpful for us to think about this as not just an issue, but the stakes are actually quite high. We all want to be obedient to the word of God, and we have to recognize that our position may lead us to be preventing half of the body of Christ from utilizing the gifts the Spirit's given them. So the stakes are quite high in the conversation at a very practical level that affects real people and their ability to use the gifts God's given them in church. So that's why I think it's such an important conversation.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, this is definitely not a small topic. So I'll kind of share with you guys, and I'd love to hear kind of, Max, you maybe maybe unpack kind of hermeneutically how you think about the way we should kind of the lenses through which we can look at this. But in terms of my background in this, kind of my interest, so I grew up in the Seattle area. I was very influenced by, a more egalitarian kind of approach to a lot of these passages, just because culturally, it did seem so insensitive and so backwards in a lot of ways to take the stuff super literally. So I began to, really question a lot of those things, going to seminary, really studying these things. Then I spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and I went on a kind of a journey of like, what is family? And it had a pretty profound transition from thinking about family in a pretty Western lens, in which a lot of these things didn't make sense to me, to thinking about family from a more Middle Eastern or ancient lens, kind of, multi-generational households, economic engines inside of families, things that are very common in the Middle East, but very uncommon, especially in the way I grew up in the West Coast. And a lot of these different passages I started looking at and finding them a lot more practical and helpful. And then in terms of like how they apply to the church, like Chris described, I saw that a lot of the ways churches were using these passages, they weren't doing church the way they did in the first century. So they were importing a lot of concepts into, the modern church. For example, a group of elders in a modern church is sort of often like a board of directors, but they would exclude women because of some of the things that it says in, 1 Timothy 3. But I don't think that it's talking about a board of directors in 1 Timothy 3. It's talking about something that was very common in ancient times, which is these kind of fathers at the gate. You see it in Ruth, you see it in a lot of these, different. There was a culture back then of how fathers at a certain stage in their life would live, and they would elder or oversee, in a way that was very different in ancient times than today. And trying to cross apply one-to-one those principles into the modern church context did end up doing what Max you described, and that it created a lot of tension that I thought was unnecessary. It creates a lot of a lot of barriers where maybe they're not, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But then I would say the last leg of my journey, and this is kind of, where this conversation kind of kicked off, was when I began to actually do church much closer to the way I think was happening in the first century. Then the codes actually started to be practical. And so that's caused me to be really like thinking about this from a totally different lens. In that, like, on one hand, I would say, if you're not going to do church the way that it's describing, then I'm not sure enforcing the codes and not actually makes a lot of sense. But if you are going to do church the way that they did, and do family the way that they did family in the first century, if you're moving closer and closer to that model, then suddenly these codes can start to be helpful and instructive. And that's I think a little bit different perspective. And I'm not really coming at this primarily from, I guess, a moralistic lens. It's much more of a practical lens. Like, these are really practical. I've seen these situations that I think the codes were designed to address actually come up as I've gotten closer and closer and closer to a first century model of family and church. So that's kind of my lens. But I'd love, Max, for you to talk a little bit about like how you see these, what's the lens through which you think makes the most sense in terms of how we can practically think about these parts of the New Testament.
Yeah, sure. So just to be clear, when we're talking about the household codes, we're going to focus on passages like Ephesians 5:21 through 6:9, that kind of the Colossians parallel.
And the First Corinthians, like I think there's the kind of the applicability of First Corinthians 10 through 14, like Chris said. I think that's another part, and also maybe First Timothy 2 and 3.
Okay. Yeah, I might distinguish between those ones. I think that the issues going on in the First Corinthians text, happy to talk about it. Admittedly, that section is a hornet's nest of interpretive questions. And it's reflecting on, at almost every point, interpreters kind of throw up their hands and try to make sense of what's going on there, even to the point where some wonder if more of it isn't, in fact, Paul quoting the Corinthians, right? So there's like people are trying to make sense of that text. We could try to walk through parts of it if you want, but just focusing on the household codes as, they're commonly thought of. So the structure, I think it's important for us to recognize that the structure is an established structure, a kind of discourse that Paul is working with, picking up on from the ancient world. We see it first articulated in this way in Aristotle's Politics a few hundred years earlier. Aristotle has the idea that the complete or perfect household, the teleos, the complete perfect word, consists of these three relational pairs: the husband, the wife, the parents and the children, although he's primarily focused on the father, and then the master and the household slaves. And so that's the kind of structure he presupposes and works with. And one of the things that's interesting about household codes, if you look at the way they develop, they're always in kind of political discourse. So they're not ever just strictly, hey, let's talk about the household, but there's always a sense of the household and the polis, the city, are very much interconnected.
Yeah.
And so I suspect that the reason Paul's drawing on this is actually because he's thinking of the church as a kind of new polis or a new community, political community, if you will. And that might be part of the reason why they come into play. So, I mean, when we think about what are they doing in the text, we have to think about, I think, several bigger hermeneutical questions. One are, what are the presuppositions that undergird the relationships within the household structure? Are those inherently biblical, or is it an assumed structure that the biblical author might be taking up and working with, right? An analogy here might be, we would probably distinguish between slavery being something that's described in both testaments and never, explicitly done away with, but not something that is in keeping with God's ultimate design for humanity. So it really involves having a conversation about like ancient patriarchy, how power was supposed to work in a very hierarchical world, and what are God's ultimate designs for his people in kind of the new creational living. I see those as like the big meta questions that you have to kind of bring with you to the text as you wrestle with what's going on. So that's kind of a big picture. If you have specifics, though, I'm happy to jump in.
So when it talks about, so you're looking at kind of, you look at the slaves and master kind of language in Ephesians 6. Okay. And so it's like, okay, he's presupposing something. This is describing, and if you're going to live underneath the sort of Greco-Roman law, here are ways that we can coexist with that, that honor God, unto the Lord, like, So but it's not advocating, master slave relationships. It's really trying to accommodate a reality. And he's being pastoral to a particular context. And then you would say now, and so the question is, how much of that would then also be applicable to his description of the husbands and wives earlier, as he's obviously making appeals to, bigger parts of the story and, like Jesus in the church. And, he oftentimes will pull, examples or foundational principles from, more universal elements. So yeah, how would you see, do you see a distinction between those two, or are they kind of in the same boat?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, again, it's a good reminder that every word of scripture is culturally embedded. So we sometimes play this game with ourselves because it's convenient. Like there's certain parts of the Bible that are cultural, we can dismiss those. And then there's other parts that are universal, but it's all one package. So the process of really drawing out the implications for us is It's a challenge of every generation. If we didn't have the presence of the Holy Spirit in the church and community, it would be impossible. So how I think about the instruction to husbands and wives is, I think that Paul is engaging in the world as it is, engaging in the household as it is, and calling the paterfamilias, although I think he's replaced the head of the household paterfamilias with Jesus. When you get to the master slave part, the reminder is you all have the same kurios, Lord in heaven, even though there are kurioi, earthly masters. So I think that the household structure is actually, God at the top. But insofar as the household typically has the paterfamilias, the man kind of that runs it, or everything's under his authority, I don't think Paul is directly undermining that. I think he's giving instruction for how to live within that. That is to say that the one with the power and the rights, essentially, is supposed to divest himself to love the other as himself, as his own flesh. And so this would lead to a kind of mutuality, and that the wife really is called to the same station that she's already been inhabiting, but the reasoning for it is always as unto the Lord. So I see this as wise instruction for living in a non-ideal, corrupt structure, and that it's love unto the Lord, which is supposed to be the thing that reorients how people relate to one another. And maybe I don't think that Paul imagined a world that would look radically different this side of the new creation, right? I don't know that Paul imagined a world in which there weren't slaves and free people and so forth. But insofar as, it's ultimately the Spirit that's inspired these texts, and there's a trajectory moving towards a new creation, I think that the more that the pattern of self-giving love is lived out in these texts, it leads us to a space of more mutuality and self-giving, and sort of puts to rest some of the questions of, like, who has the power, who gets to make the decisions. I think that actually, those kind of questions reflect part of the problem that rather than the solution. So that's, in a nutshell, that's kind of my take.
Okay, that makes sense. Given that this is really trying to address a context, and so Paul's talking to this context, there's basically corrupt elements within that context you're kind of describing. One of them is the servant master relationship, but another one potentially is the husband and wife. So you have in Roman law the patros familia, who basically has all this responsibility, and so in that context, when he literally is legally liable for everything his wife or children do, he's got to be given a lot of authority in the home. I mean, if you're in that context, but ultimately, the love of mutuality is getting closer. You're kind of like painting a picture where we're getting closer to maybe an ideal. An ideal would be one in which that power structure would be unnecessary, and Paul couldn't necessarily predict that was going to disappear with masters and servants, but it has, essentially. We don't necessarily, we don't get behind that structure anymore. And maybe he also wasn't, predicting that there's going to come a time where this mutual love is going to be what is the context within marriage and in the family. If he had seen that, then he might have, he might have written a letter that would have sounded different than the one he did.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I don't think Paul would have written Ephesians the same way today that he did in 2,000 years ago. And I would also stress that I try to always remind people, we should never make our own cultural norms the standard to which the Bible has to measure up to, because we also inhabit a broken culture. We inhabit broken marriages, broken relationships that need God's redemptive grace. So when I'm saying, what are we looking forward to? I'm actually imagining a world that's not here yet either, the new heavens and the new earth. But I think we're called to live into that.
Yeah. Okay. So let me kind of lay out, I guess, some of my questions about that and kind of how I've been thinking about this increasingly. And Max, feel free to like push back, Chris, anything here that like, oh, wow, that, here's, so it seems like, especially Max, you're one of the things that you are needing to posit for your position is that there is an ideal that we're actually moving closer to. That ideal you kind of described just broadly as the kind of more the mutuality of love. And so I would say that that the ideal that I have been really trying to understand is, does the Bible try to articulate a family design that's ideal? And if it does, where would we get the information for that? And so, and part of this comes from the fact that I grew up in a culture that had a, well over 50% divorce rate. And so it looked like something, terrible had happened to the design of the family. And I thought, man, this just sounds like just a bad idea. Like, family is just really like, it's got, talk about corruption. It's corrupt at some just deep level. Then I'm in the Middle East and I see divorce rates that are very low, and families that are highly functional. Now, there are all kinds of other issues that we could, point out, but one of them that clearly, and I just found this out recently, that in America, we actually have the number one single parent household, the largest percentage in the entire world. There's not a single country in the world with a higher single parent household percentage than the US. And so I was just somebody who was almost like, do I want to get married? Do I want to have kids? This just seems like, I'm rolling the dice on something that just isn't working. And I didn't really see, when I looked at the church, our theology of family, anything that really gave me like a completely different picture in the church. Like, all of a sudden you see these flourishing families and amazing households and, much lower divorce rates. There were such similar problems that I did see more functional. I saw, certainly improvements, especially for those who really were trying to follow the Lord and disciple their families. But in general, there was just, we seemed to be almost a lagging, sort of behind the culture, but kind of, on a similar trajectory, if that's fair. So, and so this has been, my tried project for the last 20 years. Does the Bible say something to this? And when I would talk to Jewish fathers about this, and families, and say, what's the difference between a Christian family and what the way you guys see this? You don't even have the New Testament. You don't have these family codes. They were very influenced by Abraham, as sort of a meta articulation of what fatherhood and family was about. And so they were, fathers in those cultures were as likely, or even in some cases more likely, to be like committed to family building than even their wives, because you see in this culture this drive towards building a multi-generational family and our family line, and understanding kind of where we came from historically, and and just feeling the meaning and root system that they had, and a lot of this was lived out in traditions like Sabbath dinners, and so when I read the New Testament, and the big question I'm trying to understand is, because we're both basically saying, what's the ideal we're pointing at? We talked about the mutuality of love, and I think where I started to point at, which was very unique. I had not heard about it in seminary. This was not, none of this was something that was being discussed at all. I just kind of observed it, like I described in the Middle East, that Jewish people had a picture of the household and family that they were aiming at, that started in Genesis 1, this idea of being fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue, and rule. I was told all of that is sort of like, no longer applicable. Those aren't commands that are necessarily, but again, I'm sort of like more sitting back practically saying, did we come up with a better idea or a worse idea, of what we're aiming at, and so I would distinguish maybe between two things. One is, I would say, in a relationship that I have with somebody, I do really like the language of the love of mutuality inside of a family where, and imagine like in a family you have, like in my case, I have 5 children. We have a very complex, family life. We have, we own multiple businesses. We have, ministries coming through our household. We have our house church. There's a ton of activity. It's much closer to the first century oikos. I function probably a lot more like a patros familia than your average Western dad. And in that context, now all of these codes really give life and context for my wife and I, for me and my children, for like, they all make sense in this context because of the oikos that we live in. And so so what I'm beginning to wonder is there sort of like three options here? And I'm curious what you guys think about this. Okay. Option one is, this is like, we need to all kind of overcome these codes, and sort of aim at something else, so to speak. There's something better. And so if we can, eclipse these, that's better. Maybe that's option one. Option two is like, no, we should be obeying these codes in whatever context we're in. They all are applicable. And I'm kind of like playing around with option three. And that is, if you decide to build a family the way that they built families in the first century, they are applicable. If you choose to not build a family that way, because I find it really weird if you're a Western dad and, kind of your experience of family, your wife goes to work in a different place, you go to work in a different place, you come home, and you don't own businesses, you're not doing ministries through the house. And the big questions that you're trying to answer are like, where do we want to go on vacation? What should we eat tonight? What should we watch on Netflix? And, oh, by the way, I'm the dad and I get a veto power over all of that because the Bible says that, I'm the head of the family.
Right.
I find that very strange. Like, why would you give, if the context of family is like, let's retreat and enjoy this relational, experience with each other before we all go out in our individual lives. I don't know why you would give somebody like power in that kind of a family. But what if you had a family like mine, where it's like we're making very difficult, high level decisions that impact lots of people, like a large organization would on a daily basis. And so we don't see a lot of organizations adopting models of, let's have co-CEOs, co-coaches of teams, like actually having hierarchy and power and authority isn't necessarily something that you interject because there's somebody who wants to do a power grab. It really has to do with the structure itself. And that's kind of this third, option I'm describing. So anything you guys, how would you react to that? Anything does that make sense? Do you think that's an option, or do you think no, option one is really what we need to be aiming at?
You have anything, Chris? I haven't given you a chance to talk.
No. Both of you are far more qualified to talk about this than I am. So I'm just, the more you talk, the better. But I will just kind of interject here. One thought, particularly like in Ephesians 5 and 6, where, and this is where I think, Jeremy, maybe this kind of came up when we were going through the Bible reading app, where a lot of times there's headings that are put in kind of unusual places, and so you have like right in Ephesians there's a lot of times there's a gap, or there's a heading that's put in there between chapter 5 verse 21 and 22, where it's separating the submit to one another, and then it's it's a heading, and then it goes into husbands and wives. And so I'm wondering, could it be that Paul is utilizing the structure and he's just using different words as he goes through these different relationships, but he's actually getting to the same thing? He's not going to talk about husbands submitting to their wives because that would be inappropriate for that day to talk about it that way. But then when you get to the husbands, when they're called to love their wives like Christ did, is not that submission in terms of literally going below the person to lift them up? I mean, there's no greater love than one giving their lives for somebody else. So I'm just wondering, like, is Paul, just creatively, again, using these household codes, playing with them to stay within the bounds of what's reasonable? Because as I read kind of the New Testament, even the Old Testament, God doesn't go in and just blow up cultures. He tries to seed it and move it in the right direction. Even in the Old Testament, you got polygamy and slavery. But he goes in there and he says, let's move it in this direction. So he's starting to use these other words in ways that kind of lead towards that mutuality, lead towards that mutual submission that he talks about in verse 21 there. So I just put that out there for maybe some response to it.
Yeah, that's great, Chris. That's really helpful. Yeah, you can tell a lot about Bible translators by where they put the headings. So whether they keep verse 21 with this text or whether they split it between 21 and 22. And of course, there is a variant reading that has the imperative submit in verse 22, but in the texts that are typically printed as the historical, the reconstructed text. It's not there. So you get the idea of submission, or I actually use subordination because I think that's a more accurate translation to the hierarchy. Submit sounds like a more palatable way of getting at it, but I think it's rooted in that kind of idea. So that the participle being subordinated to one another, the idea of putting yourself lower than, right, on the hierarchy, that's in verse 21. And then 22 just says, wives to husbands as unto the Lord. So you have to pick up that idea from verse 21. So I think it is definitely connected. And all of these instructions go back to verse 18, the last imperative, which is be filled with the Spirit. So Paul thinks that he's giving kind of wisdom for what a Spirit-filled living looks like. And I think using the oikos as a model for talking about the church more broadly. You see that in the household codes in First Peter too, really clearly, that the household is like the model that people are all supposed to imitate. And there Peter's got the most attention on the slave, because he's highlighting the lowest person on the totem pole in the household as the one that everybody is supposed to aspire to in the household, or in the church, which is the household of God. That's the point, right? The church is the family of God. The church is the household of God. So yeah, that's really helpful, Chris. Thanks for that. There was one other thing that I was going to say, and now it's slipped my mind, but maybe it'll come back. What was your, you had a question too, Jeremy. Maybe that will help jog.
Yeah. So I was kind of laying out these three possibilities, and yeah, that's right. So one thing I would slightly want to tweak about possibility one is I think it's a little bit more complicated. Like, there's some things Paul's doing in the household codes that are really interesting also to pay attention to in that culture. Like, for example, addressing the people in the lower position of power first. That's kind of we have the household codes are kind of like this amorphous form, like different discussions people have, but we don't have any other example of an ancient author directly addressing wives, and saying, do this as unto the Lord, or directly addressing enslaved persons. Typically it's like, hey, paterfamilias, here's how you run your home. Yes. But to another point that you made about just the functional reality of daily life, when you're talking about life in the ancient world, life in an agrarian culture, subsistence living, where everybody kind of does their role in the family, yes, the questions about like who's in charge, who does, it's more a matter of function, yes, than it is of ontology. Yes. But when you look at the household codes, the reasons why philosophers give for men being above women is always rooted in ontology. Yeah. That is to say, men are superior to women. And that seems to me that the reason men should rule is, they argue, is because they are by nature superior to women. And so I think that's something that we all would disagree with based on the Bible. But it is the reason typically underlying the justification for why ultimately a man should be over a woman. Yeah.
Could I jump in? Could I jump in with one other question to clarify here? You were talking about, Jeremy, talking with some Jewish fathers about some of their thoughts, and I'm wondering, and throw this open to Jeremy, you or Max, in terms of the difference between the Old Testament approach to this, which maybe is more along the lines of what you were talking about, Max, which would be function, versus maybe the Greco-Roman understanding, which was ontology. Mm-hmm. And where Paul might be, and I'm just throwing this out there for your thoughts, but perhaps Paul is not as willing to just jump into the Roman household code as is because of that. Mm-hmm. But maybe there's still some of these vestiges from the Old Testament that are valid and legitimate that could come through. So just kind of throw that out there. There's maybe another option.
Yeah, that's the part that to me is probably most influences me. When Peter is kind of going over his version of the household codes, he refers back to Abraham and Sarah and says, hey, wives, be like Sarah, also kind of telling dads, be like Abraham. It's, I just never, like, I spent time in seminary actually studying Abraham, like in a very intensive semester. And we never once talked about Abraham as father. He was the man of faith. We were kind of interpreting, the Torah through the lens of Abraham. but this was just a kind of a really interesting missing link, for me, because Jesus, even when he refers to Abraham in the parable, he calls him Father Abraham. Jews just think about Abraham as father. A lot of it has to do with the Hebrew. Avram means exalted father or meta father, and then of course Abraham, father of many nations. So they just constantly are hearing that this there's something going on. Not that Abraham is the perfect father, he's the meta father. He describes the way that fatherhood and God interact, and then of course all the patriarchs do throughout Genesis. And so you have in both Islamic and Jewish cultures this enormous influence Abraham has on the way they think about fatherhood, and it has almost no impact on the way Christians think about fatherhood. And so that's part of where I've taken a big step back and saying, is there a giant gap here? And if we do look at it through that lens, because we do seem to be missing something. Like, again, it's not that our experiment on family is going swimmingly, and right. And that we have something to teach the rest of the world. This is one of the things I feel like where maybe we have a major blind spot. And so but I agree in terms of what you guys are describing. I do think Paul was attacking certain elements of that Greco-Roman code, and especially its ontology. I think in 1 Corinthians 7 is the strongest version of that, where he basically tells men, you have to submit to your wives when it comes to your sexual activity. Yeah. That's never in the history of the world. We've never seen a law code that says that before. So Paul was actually, he's telling, he's articulating a very different way of doing family when he tells men that, your body belongs to your wife, and wives, your body belongs to your husband. That's a shocking statement. And it's a brand new idea that you don't see in the Old Testament, and you don't see anywhere else in the ancient world. So that's part of where I get a lot of confidence that even what you're describing, Chris, about, Paul starting with, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ before he launches into his discussion. So part of that gives me more confidence, I guess, that I think Paul is aware that he has to do a lot of like rethinking on behalf of these Gentiles who are coming into the church in terms of how they think about these things, that he's pulling them away from Aristotle and some of those basic presuppositions that they had before, and correcting a lot of those things. But I think the thing that I, you guys can hear, I have a really hard time getting over is that there was such a incredibly practical element here to what Paul's saying. When you have a very complex, you live in an agrarian society, you have subsistence living. There are so many important decisions to be made, and to have no structure is incredibly dangerous in a world like that. And so that was not imagined for that reason. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering whether or not, and this is something that I've done a lot of like trying to understand, and that is that when we live in a very stable culture, when we live in a culture where there is, you could just atomize the family into its individual components, and no one's going to starve, everyone can then pursue their own individual interests. Your wife, your husband, the children can all really be very separated. In the context of that, does the Bible have anything to say about whether or not the family ought to continue to stay as this highly functional, hierarchical team for the sake of creating this household? Is a household itself a valuable thing for us to try to hold on to? We've allowed the culture sort of to detonate the household, and now we have these nuclear families, and even that, like I described, is falling apart. And I think this progression starts somewhere further back, and I'm kind of going further back. It didn't start, and so if you keep going further back, at some point, the place where I would root it is the Christianity. We have ignored the Hebrew Scripture sort of family design, and I think that's part of where we kind of got off the train and started to join kind of the rest of Western culture on a new experiment with regards to family. And now we're so far down that line that these codes no longer really make sense anymore, which I agree they don't, given the modern Western individualistic family. I don't see how they make sense, but I wonder if, again, we should sort of root the problem much further back.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I've actually never heard anybody quite come at it the way you are. So this is really fascinating, because you're trying to, do a lot of things in one. And I think I think what I would say is I totally agree with you about, I mean, we're seeing real breakdown of the family in our culture. We're seeing a breakdown of the church. I think a lot of that, though, is rooted in American individualism broadly, beyond just, hierarchy. So where I would probably disagree is I don't think hierarchy in the family is necessary to maintain the appreciation for the family, church's family structure. It could do that, I suppose. It could be like a stabilizing force, maybe. But when I think about, like, what leads to like a breakdown in marriage, I'm not sure that the answer to that is saying if you give one party more power than the other, that's going to solve it necessarily.
Totally. Yeah.
Right. So
yeah, I agree with that.
yeah. So I think every marriage has to work itself out in a Christ-like way where both parties are coming to give themselves. I mean, I think that the picture of self-giving love in marriage on both sides is really the core of
Right.
the biblical idea of marriage. And so, in my marriage, there are things, just as an example, there are things that I'm more gifted in, and there's things that my wife's more gifted in. And so we tend to kind of defer to one another based on where gifts lie. And frankly, she makes some better decisions than I do in certain areas. And there's some places where she says, okay. And a lot of it's just, we're talking it out together. I would hate to, honestly, like for our marriage, hate to say, well, I'm the head, so I'm going to make this decision, even though you're actually more wise in this area. You've done more research in this area. You're more gifted in this area. No, I'll learn from you. Like, let's,
Yeah.
so I don't think that we have to go back to a model of a pyramid with the man at the top in order to create stability in the family. But I totally agree with you that our culture has a kind of eroded the value of family. And I think American individualism is very parasitic, and it has completely eroded the logic of community in the that's as described in the Bible.
Totally. I agree that that's really the root of the problem. And yeah, I agree. My prescriptions definitely would not be to tell a Western family, how you solve this whole problem, get hierarchical, give that father power. That's going to solve it. I guess my thesis is, this is where I always start with families, and I do this mostly with very young families. Most of the people that kind of come around our family teams ministry are in their 20s, and so what I start by saying, what kind of family do you want to build? Okay, there's different kinds of families. You can build like the typical Western family that's more like a nest. That's you raise your kids, they all go off, and you basically capitulate to Western individualism at some level. And there are rules that make that kind of a marriage and that kind of a family work. And I think more egalitarian mutuality is one of those things that likely makes that, that potentially is a superior model if you're going to adopt that kind of idea of family. I say there's another idea of family, that's being done all around the world and has been done in history. It's actually much more common historically. And that is this multi-generational team on mission, this idea of like, a family that is, where you're coming together to create a household. Now there's a ton of values that then emerge if you adopt that idea. One of them that tends to happen very quickly is there's an enormous value for more children, right? Now that creates in itself, again, a reason why these hierarchies start to make sense. I mean, if you have, much larger families and women are spending a lot more of their time in the home caring for children, and the husband is out there, trying to figure out how to provide for this growing family team. And then at some level there's an increasing division of labor anyway. Like there's going to be different scopes of your activity. They're going to become more and more diversified. And that diversity is what I think actually gives birth to the hierarchy. I think it's the need to make sure that if the husband is being freed to think about these things, and he should be constantly, getting all that advice and understanding from his spouse. But if he is going to both be held accountable for that by God and other men in his community, because we're all building households like this, and if he's got the bandwidth now to make those kinds of decisions in the same way that on a team, you wouldn't say like, because we have a coach, the quarterback is not valuable. It's that the quarterback literally, like the quarterback coach is constantly spending time looking at film, constantly thinking about these things. We've freed him up to do that, and so it's the division of labor that actually creates, I think, the distinction there more. And that's kind of how I would see it. And then, like I said, all of a sudden, you do run into this problem, which is, and I think that Paul's really addressing it. I think that it was very confusing in a world where Paul is saying theologically, there is no longer male or female. There is no longer, slave. We're all one in Christ. So he says that, and then he goes off and continues to reinforce these different sort of gender distinctions in the family. That's a very confusing, like those clash theologically. And so you have to resolve that somehow. And I think that Paul, and this is kind of where I got into the conversation with Chris and, some of the folks when we were doing the WhatsApp group, you read 1 Corinthians 11 and what our 1 Corinthians, 10 through 14, what seems to be happening is women are coming into the gathering of believers. And I think that they're rightly probably asking the question, like, it seems like if there's no longer any male or female, when I come into this space, I'm no longer under my husband. Like that, our household is melding into one household, the household of God. And so as a woman, I'm not primarily a wife, as a part of a household. I'm primarily using my spiritual gifts to build up the body in love as we're gathering together. And I think that that's accurate, except for there's one exception, and he seems to be, really making it in both chapter 11 and chapter 14, and that is when it clashes with your husband. Right. Like if your husband I've seen this in gatherings, where this becomes very practical. If a husband is saying something, in the gathering, is that the right time for his wife? It's probably the most awkward moment I've ever seen in a gathering is anytime a wife contradicts her husband while he's trying to build up the body with his gift. And I have seen this dynamic. And I would think just theologically that she should do that, given what Paul said in Galatians. Like, use your gift, like you're in the body. And I think Paul's like, no. Even in the body, you need to, like, you can do that at home. Like you need to confront your husband. You need to deal with that there. Let this, that you can be a wife if your husband's speaking. And in any other context where the body's doing its thing, you're 100% your gift. You're completely free. But you do have to, because you enter this portal of the church, it doesn't mean that you're automatically no longer underneath that household. And that's where I'm saying, like, this actually gets really practical, because I would want to know the difference. Is it appropriate for a wife? Because we have these, open participatory gatherings, where we don't kind of do church in a way where we predetermine who's going to talk. Everyone talks, and everyone's gifts are trying to be released at the same time. And in that context, knowing if there's family order that still applies is a really big question that needs to be answered. And so we've said, well, it seems like it does. That's a tiny fraction of what needs to happen. So we don't feel like it's onerous on a wife to try to resist, doing that one thing in the body for the sake of unity in her family. But that's the only caveat. Everything else, I think, is fair game. She can teach, she can, like, whatever her gifts are, but he's saying, like, do it with your head covered, because of course that's the symbol of I am under my husband. I don't know if that symbol is necessary because we don't use that symbol today, but I think that the principle, I would say, still applies.
Yeah. So yeah, no, that's good. I mean, I think that what we have to do with that section of 1 Corinthians is we have to try to figure out what the scenario is to begin with, because and that's what's so tricky about it. It gets very circular quickly, because whatever we think the scenario is, then Paul's words seem to be speaking to that. And right. And even whatever scenario we presuppose, there's still parts of the conversation that always don't quite fit. So it's like, it's tricky. I'm sure they did fit for him, but we're 2,000 years removed. I mean, I think you can see even interpreters a couple hundred years removed from that letter struggling with how to make sense of everything there. So when it comes to the head covering thing, I think there's the discussion of whether it's strictly just about hair length. So is there just a breakdown of gender distinction? And Paul's arguing against that, or is it actual head covering for women? And My understanding is that's the more likely interpretation. The phrase in Greek is highly ambiguous, but as you go on, I think it makes better sense, especially when he later says that the woman has the long hair in place of the veil.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Which I kind of wonder is then at that point, if he's actually telling them, you don't need to have your head covered, the hair is enough, kind of thing. So that would fit then with some arguments that see part of that discourse as the Corinthian position rather than Paul's.
Okay.
But it's just to say it's very complicated. But I do think that the principle of honoring the other person and not shaming them, there's a lot of shame language in those passages. If you keep reading on the next text, about the Lord's Supper and abusing the Lord's Supper, he also says you're shaming the poor among you. So there's a real concern here for social dynamics of honor and shame. And so I think that that's what's got to be partly driving this conversation. That's the behavior. I think it is wives. So let's say wives are coming into the congregation without a head covering, and the men are concerned about that. They're concerned because it's communicating that their wives are maybe not married, for example, right? There's some or some kind of thing. What makes this tricky also is there's no like universal set of agreements in the Greco-Roman Empire around head coverings. So people have different ideas, which is probably why they're arguing about it, right? So so I think that's probably what's going on, is the concern for the statement, like, I'm not under my husband, and maybe there's some level of, suggestion about sexual promiscuity as well that's undergirding this. And so, Paul wants to deal with that, along with the confusion that's going on. But as you said, with making the idea here is that women that are empowered to prophesy in the church do that.
Yes. Yeah.
And so then when you get to 1 Corinthians 14, that end section where he's talking about women being silent and asking your husbands at home and everything like that, that's a really confusing text too. One, many interpreters don't think it actually is original to the letter, or is like kind of a later insertion maybe, or maybe more likely he's actually quoting the Corinthian position and rebutting it. And the reason for that, I think that one's more plausible as a potential quotation and rebuttal, because he launches back into this rhetorical question, or did the word of God originate with you? And the gender of the you there is now masculine. Whereas before he was giving instructions to wives about feminine, if it was his kind of take. It's a very jarring shift, and it's hard to make sense of.
Those rhetorical questions are consistent with other quotations that he uses earlier in the letter. Yeah.
So I wonder there if he's actually going after a group of men that maybe is being restrictive of women in some way. But it's impossible to prove that. And only to say though that the language about being silent and stuff like that, we have to be I just really careful, because obviously he can't mean that in an absolute sense. He's already given instructions about women to prophesy. And there's just so much evidence in the New Testament of women speaking and leading in churches that it's kind of hard, unless Paul is just contradicting himself, to take these silence statements as like absolute laws. Which I don't hear you saying at all, but just to kind of throw that 100%. Out there. Yeah.
Go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
I just wonder, too, if, we come to these and we have, obviously there's background that we're missing. We don't have all the details of what's happening here, but it seems like a lot of times the commands are directed at those who seem to be the offenders in the particular situation, the ones that are most commonly the offenders. And so it's addressing a problem that's coming up. It might be sometimes addressed towards the men. Men are, in the other context, men are to love their wives, and wives are to submit to their husbands, and using different ways of doing it. So when we come to a passage like this, and you gave your example, Jeremy, of in your house church gatherings, would there be a time where we would say, like, there's a principle here, and we would want to then see how this principle might work itself out with, men to women, or women to men, or children to parents. And
Yes.
how do we expand the principle here, of not doing things that are shameful, but loving each other, and seek maybe a larger principle to apply than just maybe this one application that was right here for a situation that was very unique to that one setting. So I
Yeah.
just throw that out there for consideration.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really, I mean, certainly that's the larger purpose of the whole, the whole 4 or 5 chapters, is that Paul's trying to create a maximally active body, that is really good at stewarding gifts in order to love each other. Like that's definitely the larger principle, and everything is serving that. But it's bookended with this one kind of concern that, like I said, if you're going to try that, and I think so many people have never even been in a gathering where they've tried that. Try to get a group of believers together, like 20 or 30 in a living room, activate all the gifts at the same time,
Right.
without letting disorderliness break out, and that we're going to feel built up and loved. And man, what you'll discover if you attempt that, is that there's a few scenarios that are really going to cause issues, and they all are listed in 1 Corinthians 14. And it's amazing to me how practical that chapter suddenly becomes. It's sort of like a bit of a kicking ball for almost, for theologians to ponder about today, because we don't have gatherings like that. And so it's really confusing. But as somebody who's a practitioner of a 1 Corinthians 14 style gathering, I find it extremely helpful. I mean, because he even says, just before he launches into the conversation about wives being silent, he says to, he talks about 2 or 3 prophets speak, the rest of you listen, and then, you weigh what is said. And then he goes on and talks about, wives in that context. And at the end of that, the whole chapter, he then reemphasizes, he's talking about prophecy. And so that's why, to me, it seems like that's a really valuable thing, because if he's commanding all of us to weigh the 2 or 3 sort of prophecies during a gathering, which is what generally happens. We do a gathering, there's about 2 or 3 topics that tend to come up. And then there's like this ping pong thing that happens with various gifts, and people are like teasing it out and praying, and that's happening. And like I said, if you want to throw a huge wrench in that, building us up, have a wife suddenly like weigh in negatively on what her husband said. So that I find, again, it's a fascinating thing to, like, if you recreate the scenario that Paul's describing, then you suddenly might discover the practicality of the commands. And because I held for probably 2 decades to the kind of the quotation, interpretation. I was taught that in Bible college. I think there are good arguments for that. And because it made no sense to me practically, other than like, this is so weird. It's telling women to be quiet right after it tells them to prophesy in the church with their head covered, like that. That is very strange. And so that's all I needed to sort of buy into that interpretation, until I saw it happen in real time. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I've never heard anybody attempt this, and to see that that's actually a practical problem that needs to be addressed. Because in these gatherings, to have 30 or 40 people, if you have households, you're only talking about 3 or 4 wives. I mean, you've got all these kids, you've got husbands. It's very likely that a wife is going to weigh in on her husband's, whatever he's bringing to the gathering. And usually it's positive, but she's probably the one person that's most comfortable opposing him. That's her job as his wife. That's what it says all the way back in Genesis 2. The purpose of a suitable helper is somebody who is opposing. And so she's got the most practice at it. She's very used to like saying, hey, like she's very aware if there's something he's saying that feels a little out of order. And so that dynamic is very, very likely. And that's kind of where I found, ooh, wow, this is interesting. It's practical.
Have you ever seen, Jeremy, I'm just curious, have you ever seen it the other way, where the husband comes in and says something to the wife and it just blows up the room? Because in our context, again, we don't have the pater familias kind of hierarchy going on. So we're coming in more egalitarian wherever you come in on that issue, but we're coming into it more egalitarian just by being Americans. Where I could see that being just equally as, dropping a bomb on the whole, spirit moving and everyone sharing mutually.
Yeah. And in fact, I think that's a really good point, Chris. I was thinking the same. And man, if I had a nickel for every time a male pastor used his wife in a less than flattering way for an illustration in a sermon, I'd be a very rich man. So yeah, it's I think that's a good question to ask. Do you see that reciprocal, or is it strictly the wife can't speak in on her husband, right? Because I think that'd be good.
No, it's a good question. And I do think that then, sort of levels up to this larger context where somebody is constantly speaking for the family. Like this is a daily constant thing in that culture. When you have a household and there's like business negotiations happening all the time. I mean, there's that one of my favorite movies, The Godfather. The whole thing blows up because his son, in the middle of a negotiation says like one sentence, and the rest of the movie is about how that destroyed the family. And I thought that was such a fascinating example and he turns to his son and says, you cannot do that in public. You cannot, like contradict what I'm saying when we're in a public setting. It was, and in that case, of course, they're mafia, and so it was super dangerous and whatever. But it's a fascinating reality that what I'm describing is, if you're in that full culture where the husband is expected to speak on behalf of the household, and so if there's a disagreement, it needs to happen behind closed doors. But when you're in public, it's okay for the father to speak out. It's not okay for the wife to speak out in a way that contradicts what her husband said. I'm just saying that is a very normal thing in every business I've been a part of. It's been that way. If I'm the CEO and I'm in a public setting negotiating with a client, and I have somebody who's a vice president of the company contradicting me in public while I'm speaking, that's a problem. So again, I think it does speak to that larger question of, are we households or not? If you're trying to build a household and you own lots of assets as a family and you're building, multi-generational connections, and then these hierarchies actually have extremely they make sense. And it would be very threatening to have this one place I go to every week where that just detonates. Like anything could happen, and nobody's going to respect, my role in the family, that as soon as we leave this gathering, now, I'm back to being the patros familia and all that responsibility is on me, but I have to deal with the fallout of sort of the, of the disorderliness that happened in the household in that context. So that's why I like these three options. Maybe we can kind of close with this, and this is kind of where I'm kind of wrapping it up, because I do think in these three options, I think that I'm comfortable with all three. Again, if you're going to build a Western family, I think that a lot of these codes, I don't understand how I have respect for people that just say, look, I'm just going to trust the Bible and we're going to, have hierarchy in our home, even though, we're all Western individuals in this family. That seems a little strange to me. I'm very interested in this third option, where if you're going to build a household, that you would, think through the practical implications of these codes. So, but I do think that I'd prefer to start with that question. What kind of family are you building? What kind of church are you building? That would almost determine how many of these passages of scripture become applicable.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think what's good is we all agree at the end of the day, the ideal is the performance of the love we see in the Christ story to one another. Yes. And so whatever structures we inhabit or try to inhabit or create, that's got to be the thing that animates everything we do, how we relate to one another. And there have been throughout history different kind of marriages, different kind of households, and we have that today. And we do live in a world where we maybe have more options as to the kind of household we do inhabit. But I think from the biblical perspective, what's got to be at the core is Jesus, the gospel story. And if that is leading towards life-giving, kind of fruitful relationships between the people in the household, then maybe we do have some options there, yeah. Even though we would probably all articulate ours as being the best,
Right.
Well said. One other thing just to throw out there too that I think is really interesting. Susan Hyland just recently wrote a book that's really helpful. It takes a little bit of a different angle on this, not specifically focused on the household codes, but it's called Finding Phoebe, kind of a more popular book out of her larger research with some new angles to it. And one of the things that she shows, I think, really clearly is that when we're talking about these conversations in the ancient world, we always got to remember it's not strictly gender-based or sex-based. It's also class-based. So there's an intersection of gender, sex, and class that comes together. Whereas, and what we see in the ancient world is a lot of times women do exercise authority over men even. And when it's a woman of higher status, it seems to be more acceptable in that culture as well. And so we find in the New Testament a lot of women leading because they have homes to create space for other people to come, or they're patrons, they're supporting others financially. And so that's another thing to kind of put in there, that alongside that cultural ideal of the woman being silent, which really was less about not saying anything and more about being self-restrained. So you can think of kind of like the virtues that both men and women should have of self-restraint. Right. The way women often demonstrated that in public was through being silent, more silent. Alongside that stands the other facet, which is that women are speaking and teaching and doing stuff all over the ancient world, not just in the church, but within broader society. I mean, we even have examples of women who are leaders of synagogues, called elders in the synagogue. They're a minority, but we have these examples from the ancient world. So we never want to, overly simplify the picture. I think we see it all kind of meld together in the New Testament. And that's another historical piece that I think we have to just wrestle with today.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Max. I do think that there is, I think Paul in the gospel is busy detonating what was normal to them about class, about gender. And I do think that it was intended to create the maximal amount of freedom for slaves to totally, engage, for women to totally engage, anyone who was historically, disempowered. And what I'm reading into it, as you guys see, is like with this one caveat in the household with the patris familia present, that still needs to apply. But I agree 100% that you do see something radically different happening, what Paul's doing there. Chris, any last words from you? We wrap this up.
No, I just thank you, Jeremy, for having us on, and Max for agreeing to be on with us today. It's been a great discussion, so thank you.
Yeah, sure. Excellent. Yeah, well, thank you guys both. This has been great. Appreciate you guys jumping on this today.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.